As I said to you in the opening of our broadcast, good morning and welcome to CFC Online. I'm so glad you joined us today. And obviously, if you've joined us today, we're all connected, or if you're seeing this like this, we're all connected online because snow, in fact, did arrive. In fact, go back with me a few days and in the weekend, and just I want to review kind of how my week has gone. So Monday, the holiday, I opened up my weather app and happened to look and see that they were calling for snow this weekend. And like most times, I didn't think much of it, but when I flipped to it, it said at that point in time, 22 to 28 inches of snow. And I said out loud, "What? This can't be true." Probably just like you, we started checking the weather and started following the story. And as the day went on, I don't know about you, but I follow Jay's wintry weather. And as I was following Jay, he was talking about models and all this kind of stuff, things I didn't know. But I then learned, there are certain times of the day where the models get run again and there's updates. And so, I would click on and get the update, and I'd get the update and I'd get the update. And as the week went on, there wasn't a whole lot of variance. And I kept saying to myself, well, how do we know? Here's all these models and here's all these projections and here's all these people that are armchair weathermen. And, but, how do we know? How do we know? How do we know? But as I was saying that out loud, I thought, boy, what a great question for this week, because it really kind of sets up our conversation. And so how we know is we're here, right? This is how we know today that the storm has arrived. You are warm, I hope, and in your place, and I am here in my place, and we are weathering the snow and ice and whatever else will develop. And so, but the question, how do we know? How do we know? We've been in this series called Illuminated in the book of First John, written by the same author as the Gospel of John and the disciple of Jesus. And he wrote to his friends in Ephesus, there in Asia Minor, or that area of Ephesus in Asia Minor, that this letter in response to some heresies that had arisen. And we've talked about that over the past few weeks, that the heresies were around the fact that the spirit is all that matters, the flesh, we can't control that, and it is what it is. And, so we don't have to worry about that. We get to kind of basically do whatever we want. And there was a second heresy about whether or not Jesus actually came in the flesh. And so he's writing to kind of handle that. And so as we've seen in the first couple of messages, he's responding directly to those heresies. But as we turn the corner today, we kind of move into a little bit of a different section as he moves from responding to those heresies to giving us some practical understanding of this thing that is our faith. So today we're gonna take a look at 1 John chapter 2, verses 3 through 11. If you want to go ahead and grab your Bible or open your other device that you're not watching this on, and get your Bible app out and follow along. And as you do that, I want to just start by reading the text this morning, because the text actually embraces that question: how do we know? Yeah, how are we going to know as this heresy is going on, or these heresies are going on, and Paul is, I mean, pardon me, not Paul, John is writing to the fellow believers there about how they will know if they're in the light. And we're going to see how he addresses that question. In fact, he addresses it head on. But follow with me, verse 3 of First John chapter 2. And we can be sure that we know him. He starts off right there with the implied question, actually the express question in some translations. There's some translations that actually render that sentence, how can we know that we know him? And you may have a translation that has something very similar to that, but obviously the question is there. How do we know that we know? How are we going to be able to know that? Hold that question throughout the morning, because it is a critically important question. So he says, and we can be sure that we know him if we obey his commands. If someone claims, I know God, but does not obey God's commandments, that person is a liar. He's talked about deceiving ourselves in the previous passage. If we say we have no sin, then we're deceiving ourselves. We're a liar. And now he's saying, if we don't live out what what we say, or we don't live out according to the commands of God, then again, we are a liar. So he says that person is a liar and he's not living in the truth, or they are not living in the truth. But those who obey God's word truly show how completely they love him. This is how we know we are living in him. Those who say they live in God should live their lives as Jesus did. Dear friends, I'm not writing a new commandment for you. Rather, it's an old one you have had from the very beginning. This old commandment to love one another is the same message you heard before. Yet it's also new. Jesus lived in the truth of this commandment, and you are also living it. For the darkness is disappearing and the true light is already shining. If anyone claims I am living in the light but hates a fellow believer, that person is still in darkness. Anyone who loves a fellow believer is living in the light and does not cause others to stumble. But anyone who hates a fellow believer is still living and walking in darkness. Such a person does not know the way to go, having been blinded by the darkness. So, as John writes this, you can see he's writing to answer the question, how do we know that we know? I was thinking about this passage and I was reminded of something about my childhood. When I grew up, we had in our family a list of words that you could not say. I don't know if you had that, and probably for most of us, there was at least an informal list of words that were comprised of basically the same few words that we were not allowed to say. But in my household, there was kind of a was like a B list, an addendum list, some additional words that would get discipline, almost immediately. In fact, there was one word that if I said it, I got as much discipline and as harsh a response as if I had said like the big bad ones. Like, as I was thinking about that, we're coming out of Christmas season, and I don't know about you, but when I get into Christmas season, there's a certain set of movies I need to watch. They're just a part of the Christmas tradition. Some of you do the same thing. You've been down the rabbit hole of Hallmark, and that's your particular movie that you need to binge on. I just want to tell you they're all the same thing. It all, winds up the same way. But besides that, I'm kind of a traditionalist classics movie guy, and one of my must-see movies in the course of the holiday season is A Christmas Story. If you've ever seen that movie, it's kind of a throwback story of a mid last century family in what I assume is the upper Midwest, and all the things that went with Christmas during that time, particularly from the perspective of a child. And the child was Ralphie, desperately wanted a Red Ryder BB gun, and the patent answer was, "You'll put your eye out." That's we know that line from the movie. But in the movie, there's a moment where Ralphie utters one of the big bad words. In fact, it's the mother of all bad words, they say in the movie, and he says it, but the movie doesn't say the word. He said they put an alternative word in there, and Ralphie voices over and says, "Except I didn't say that word. I said the word." And the reaction is fascinating. There is a wild response. The father, immediately scolds and disciplines him, sends him back into the car. When the father gets in the car, he tells mom what happens. Mom is in hysterics, thinking that her little boy has said such a bad, bad word. Little brother is in shock back there that it would come out of Ralphie's mouth. They get home. The mom calls the friend that Ralphie says taught him the word, and then you can hear over the phone line the other mom screaming and wailing and seeking out the other child to discipline the other child. And the scene there is Ralphie sitting with a bar of soap in his mouth because he had said the mother of all bad words. I watch that as he's got Lifebuoy there in his mouth, and I think about times when I got that kind of discipline, and it was over a word that might surprise you. A word that is not in the big bad words, but it was a bad word in my house. See, there was this rule that we couldn't say these words, but we could use the words if we were quoting scripture. So if it showed up in the Bible, the word was permissible. And this was the word. I can say it because it shows up in our text. Hate. Uh, I would say, "Oh, I hate that food." And I would get in severe trouble. I would say, "Oh, I hate sweeping the garage." discipline's coming. And it wasn't because I was resistant to the food or the chore or any other thing. It was because I said that bad word. And I can hear vividly, as if it happened just before I started recording this, my mom saying, "We don't say hate. We don't say that. We don't do that. Hate is a horrible word." I don't know if you grew up with that tradition, but I got a feeling that even if you didn't grow up with that tradition, you might feel the sentiment, the idea that hate is a bad thing. And John, in this passage, he points out that hate is a thing that we should avoid. It is a bad thing. In fact, he says, if you have hate, you're living in darkness. Look at what verse 11, where we end. He ends up with this statement: "But anyone who hates a fellow believer is still living and walking in darkness. Such a person does not know the way to go, having been blinded by the darkness." This is a severe statement that you're still in darkness. You're unable to move forward. You don't know the way to go. You're stumbling around, and more importantly, causing others to stumble. It's all because of that word hate, because it is something to be avoided, according to this passage. Now, here's what's fascinating. When Paul, I'm going to keep interchanging that. When John writes this, he's writing into a cultural context that has injected a ideological perspective or a theological perspective that is causing division and evaluation across the lines of the divide. And in causing that division, it is creating a culture that is hateful. People are feeling that dismissive feeling that happens when there is hate. And when we think about that word hate, and when John uses the word hate, probably the imagery that immediately comes to our mind are all the big, bad, egregious offenses of hate that our world has seen over the course of time. But there's a nuance beneath that. That is true. There are examples of hate where it is clear that the expression of hate means I detest you, or I abhor you, or I loathe you. And that is very, very true. But hate has a nuance beneath that. It is not merely the furthest, most extreme expression, but it also has an expression in a smaller way, or in a more subtle way. And here's the definition: as I looked it up and I started doing some exploration of that word. To hate is to esteem less and to love less, to devalue others. That's hate. Now, it can mature into all of the offenses that we've seen, but it can also live in the shadows of our life as a devaluing, a lessening of our esteem for, a lessening of the love that we give. That's just as much hate. And I quite frankly think that is more of the nuance of what John is writing to. That there's this divide around theology that is causing fellow believers to esteem less, love less, devalue one another. We know that when hate happens, it's a bad thing, but why is it bad? Well, let me just think of a few things, or let's brainstorm a few things for a moment that make hate a bad thing. Let's start with this. When we hate, we disregard God's stated value for the other person. That we look at the other person and we don't see the same value that God declares is true of them, and we throw out God's value statement about them. That's what happens when we hate. When we hate, it creates a judgment towards the other. That I have this feeling, and in order for me to validate this feeling, to esteem you less, to devalue you, I have to judge you as less than me. So it creates that judgment that happens. It causes a habit or a pattern of image cultivation that rather than creating a lifestyle of transparency, it creates this. We talked about it last week. This image projection that's not completely true, because we hide parts of ourselves, because hate judges the parts of ourselves that we keep hidden. So we create this culture, this habit, this pattern of lack of transparency, of image maintenance. And then hate divides and it creates enemies. And that's what's happening in the church. People are being asked to choose sides. And the problem with choosing sides, there's no problem with determining right and wrong, except when we decide we're going to determine right and wrong of ideology, and therefore that makes you less. And so what happens inside the church is that people are choosing sides and creating enemies of fellow believers rather than brothers and sisters who put their arms around one another and help them move forward towards truth. And then finally, hate creates confusion. And John's writing into that confusion, trying to clear it up. And so what he does is he says, I'm not just going to give you a bad word, but in fact, I'm going to rebuttal the bad word with a series of good words. And so there's a series of 3 4-letter words I want you to see as we kind of make our way through the text over the next few minutes. And it's a rebuttal to the idea of hate, because hate is the darkness. And John is writing to walk us out of the darkness into the light, walk those believers out of the darkness into the light, and walk us into the truth. And so he's answering this question, how do we know that we know? How do we know that we know? That's where he starts. He says, this is how we'll know. How do we know that we know? And so here, the first word, or the first overview, or not first, but the overview that I want to give you is, how do we know that we know? Well, we know that we know if we live like Jesus and we love like Jesus. There's the bottom line today. That's the message in a sentence. It shows up in the middle verse of this passage. How do we know that we know? Well, if we live like Jesus and we love like Jesus, then we know that we know. But the process to get there, the process to live that way and love that way, John gives us these 3 4-letter words. So the first one, he said, how do we know that we know? We know that we know because we know. It's a funny sounding statement, isn't it? But it's an important word. How do we know that we know him? How do we know that we know? We do because we know. The word is know. Now, when John writes this word know, he's telling us something more than just we acquire information or we acquire knowledge. The idea of knowing here for John is much more than the mastery or the consumption of information. In fact, it digs beneath the surface. It is in fact a deeper kind of experience that when he says no, now let me pause here before I tell you what he's meaning. But when John writes about knowing, many commentaries or commentarians will say knowledge is one of the big themes of this entire letter, because John is pursuing this idea of knowing. This knowing, though, is not information, it's experience. So when he writes know, that how do we know that, how do we know him? We've had an experience that leads to ongoing consequences. Now, it's important for us to keep context in mind. And the context of this letter is that John is writing to believers. He's not writing to the broad culture. While there are principles that are true and helpful for the broad culture, that's not his intent and purpose. He's writing to believers, to you, to me, as followers of Jesus, and for them as well as followers of Jesus. And so when he's talking about knowing and this experience that leads to a consequence, he is talking in spiritual terms. So let's break this out in spiritual terms. What John is fundamentally and practically saying is to know, the way that we know is we've had an experience with the living God, an encounter with the living God that changes our tomorrow, that changes us. Now, I don't believe that in any way, shape, or form that's one experience. I think it's a life of experiences. It's a life of encounters. That's a reason he's writing to believers, is you need to continue to have these experiences where you know him, where you have an encounter with the living God, with Jesus, in a way that shapes your tomorrow. See, I want to tell you this today, and this is kind of a hidden extra gem inside this text, and it's this, that Jesus wants to change your tomorrow. And he wants to change the tomorrow after that and the tomorrow after that. He wants you to have an experience with him on a regular basis, an encounter with him on a regular basis that transforms you, that changes your tomorrow. We are fortunate where we live. We live in an area that is filled with monuments and museums. At least I think it's fortunate because I love visiting those places. And I love going and seeing things from antiquity. I love seeing the history of our nation. I love all those things. My family, well, they'll go with me. They like being with me, but they would rather me be faster because they get frustrated that I read every little placard that's there. And so I've gone to these museums, I've gone to these monuments, and I've consumed all this knowledge. But I can tell you this, that very little of that knowledge remains. Like I'll read it, and there's certain little facts that I'll carry with me and I can remember. But as a whole, I've forgotten more than I've learned. And very few, if any, of those pieces of information had a transformational impact on me, had a extending consequence on my life. It's just interesting. Yeah. That's not what John is writing about, but he's writing about what happens when we have a deep, meaningful, rich encounter with the living Jesus, so much so that it changes how we live. He's writing about this idea. And what happens is that when we have this encounter, when we know, well, then we develop an affection for God. Some of us, we're going to dig into some words, beyond this one. And some of us think that as he's talking about this idea of love, that he's talking about our idea of love for God. And you're going to see in a minute that he's actually going in a little bit different direction with that as he goes through these next few verses. But knowing means that we came face to face with the God who loves us, and we have an affection, a love for him that develops, that drives us to let our encounter with him change us. Okay, so love is actually the preceding word, but it's also the closing word that he's going to use, and we'll go back and visit that. But if we know, if we've had this encounter with the living God, then we'll also create patterns and habits as a result of our knowing God. That there's a rhythm that occurs in our life because, well, we've had a encounter with the living God that has consequence on the rest of our life. And so we start to develop habits and patterns out of that change. Beyond that, when we know, we have a perspective of life and the world and of others through the lens of Jesus. It changes how we see the circumstances around us and how we deal with the circumstances that we face. So, so John's writing and he says, here's the first four-letter word I want to give you. We know that we know because we know. Now, knowing leads to the second word because it leads to action. Knowing leads to this. How do we know that we know? We obey. That's the second four-letter word. So John says, not only do we know that we know because we know, but we know that we know because we obey. Our knowing produces action. You're going to see each of these three words build upon each other. Our knowing produces action. It produces obedience. And so as you look at that word, you may have a Bible translation because translators use these two words interchangeable. They either use obey or keep. They either write obey his commands or keep his commands. And the idea there is that we are shaped by the direction, the message of Jesus. Our theme throughout, or our statement that we've made throughout the series so far is that truth is determined by the message and life of Jesus. That's how we know what truth is. And so our life starts to model that. It starts to reflect that. He says that is how we'll know that we know, as we begin to obey the directions of Jesus. Our life starts to look the part. It starts to, this is who I am, not simply because I have a list of instructions, not simply because I'm keeping the directions right or I'm following orders, but I do this because this is who I am. I'm reflecting the one that I love. So over the past several months, the fall, as is true every fall, my Saturdays have been filled with college football. And college football it's a fun experience for me. I love watching it, and so every Saturday, I'm tracking games and keeping up with scores. And then we get to the end of Saturday, and there's always this evaluation of the day. Who did well, who fell off, and there's always a common thread of conversation, particularly in college sports. Who's the best team in college football? And so everybody makes their case for why their team is the best team in college football, and who have they beaten and how many games have they not lost. And there's a phrase that gets used regularly as that evaluation happens. They stand up to the eye test. They look the part. And as the year goes on, that season develops, and you see losses, and you see circumstances where the eye test starts to, weed out teams, and we get to what we experienced this past week, where a team comes and they make their way through the playoffs, and in the case of the Indiana Hoosiers, they're undefeated and they win the championship game fully looking the part. And very few, if any, people would argue that Indiana winds up being the best team in football. How do we know that? They look the part. They look the part. They look like champions. They play like champions. They behave like champions, not because they're following directions, but because this is what champions do. This is who they are. In the same way, this is what John is calling his believers to, or his friends to, and what he's calling us to, is that as we are following Jesus, how do we know that we know him? We know that we know him if we look the part, if we obey his commands. Now, obeying his commands is kind of interesting because, well, he throws in a little phrase here that is going to not only be interesting for obedience, but it's going to be interesting as a bridge into the last of the four-letter words. He says this, that we will know that we are in him. We will know that we know him if we live like Jesus. If we live like Jesus. And he injects this idea that our lives start to look like the life of Jesus. They start to take on that appearance, that we do the things that God has asked us to do by all means. We follow the instructions that are laid out, but we move beyond that. We care in the way that Jesus cared. Our motive for why we do what we do is like Jesus' motive. It's not in order to be compliant or to follow the directions, but it's actually because this is who we are. And this is what people of our type do. This is how we behave. In fact, the word obey there is kind of interesting in that there's certainly the follow the instructions aspect of it, but because they use that word keep interchangeably, the original language, the word has a deeper nuance in this. It has a measure of guarding and protecting. Like this is the idea of I do this because, well, if I don't do this, then this isn't genuine. This is not the way it's supposed to be. I do this because this is who I am. I'm protecting the brand. I'm protecting the shield. I'm protecting the character. This is the essence of it. And so John says, when we know, when we're sure that we know, the way that we know is we obey and we care like Jesus cared, and we view and feel about the world around us the way Jesus viewed and felt about the world around us. In fact, as you go down through that section, you come to what I think is a really critical verse in these few verses. And it's verse 6. He says this: those who say they live in God should live their lives as Jesus did. You want to get the essence of it? How do you know that? How do we know? Live like Jesus did. That's how we know. Is my life, does it look like Jesus? Am I living like Jesus? We know because of how we obey. And obeying is more than acting, it's becoming like Jesus. And here's what motivated Jesus. If we're going to live like Jesus did, that means we're going to have to love like Jesus did. See, it was love that drove him. In fact, every turn in his life, as you look at his public life through the Gospels, you'll see that it is all driven by love. That's the third of the four-letter words. Love. How do we know that we know? We love. We love like Jesus did. How do we know that we know? How do we know that we're in him? How do we know that we're in the light? We know, we obey, and we love. We know. How do we know? We know because we live like Jesus did, and we love like Jesus did. This idea of love, John talks prolifically about love throughout this little letter. He says in this little letter, he uses the word love. It's the Greek word agape. And he uses that 18 times. That is more than any other book in the New Testament. Yeah, you think about all the different places where love is talked about. John uses it more than anyone else because love is the important theme here. Now, when he talks about the idea of love, he introduces it early in this thought process, these couple of paragraphs. In this, he says this phrase, verse 5, he says, "But those who obey God's word truly show how completely they love him. This is how we are living in him. And this is how we know we are living in him." And as you think about that, some of you have a translation that reads a little bit differently, that when we obey, then love is perfected in us. God's love is perfected in us. And I want to just pause for a minute and kind of clarify something here. When the text says love is perfected in us, it is not saying that God's love is somehow lacking or somehow incomplete. What in fact it's saying is that our expression of love becomes more mature. It is completed. It is the incomplete nature of our love for God rather than the incomplete nature of God's love for us. And so as we take a step in obedience, the love that we have for God, our love for God is perfected or is completed. And that's what that text means. And so John interjects this idea of loving and saying we ought to have love, but then he takes it further and he makes it clear that as we love, it's love like Jesus. That's why he uses that word agape, that we have this self-sacrificing love for others. And he really drills down on this as he turns the corner into those last few verses. He says there's a old commandment that I'm reiterating and making new. And he clarifies it. And when he says there's an old commandment, he says the old commandment there is to love. And as soon as he says love, probably like you, the reader, John anticipated, would think love God. Because in Deuteronomy 6, we're shown that all of the Hebrew children, all of God's people were to learn this mantra. You are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. But this love is beyond that. And John reminds them of this, that throughout the entire text, and emphasized by Jesus is this, that we're to love one another. Jesus would take that, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and he would elaborate on it and he'd say, and then you are to love your neighbor as yourself, that you're to love God and you're to love your neighbor. In fact, he would say in a way that says, as you're loving your neighbor, it demonstrates that you love God. That the way to love God is to love your neighbor. And so John is leaning into that and he's saying, you know this. You know that Jesus taught this. Now, here's the thing. That's the old part of it. Here's the new part. Jesus came and showed it to you. So if you live like Jesus did and you love like Jesus did, you've seen it, you can model that, you can follow his example, and you love in a self-sacrificing way. Because if you stop and just reflect for a moment on the kind of love that Jesus had, both for us as future generations, but for the immediate people around him, it was a give himself away kind of love. And John calls us to that. You know, in a culture that John's writing into, where the fundamental theology was basically saying, satisfy your desires. The flesh is fair game. You can do whatever you want. You know, injecting in there a self-sacrificing love priority is countercultural. This is a profound shift. Here's what's different for those who are in the light, who are following Jesus versus those who are being deceived by the heresy, is that we are living out love, sacrificial love like Jesus. You know, last week I loved that Brian brought us to that point where we thought through this idea of confession. And I love how the Bible just lays out God in his sovereignty and knowing exactly what we need, linked together these two sections. So the idea was that we would find freedom, we would find light in confession, that living in transparency was the dream that God had offered to us. And Brian articulated that beautifully as he closed the message last week. And as I was thinking about it, it occurred to me that as we turn the corner into this section, this is our challenge for confession. I'm not sure there's a harder ask by God of his people than for us to be confessing people. It's just not natural. It's not easy. It's not fun, right? But here's the truth. There is freedom in it, right? And John's writing here and he's saying, okay, be a confessing people, but in order to be a confessing people, the judgment that you fear is not the judgment of God, it's the judgment of your peers that pushes you to hide, that pushes you to cultivate an image. So learn to love sacrificially so that confession abounds and transparency abounds and light spreads. And he says very strongly, listen, if you don't love, then you hate. And if you hate, you're living in the darkness. And there's an interesting nuance to this idea of hate here. Hate lives in the shadows of our life more than it lives out in the main thoroughfare. There's little subtle ways. It's not all about the big loathing, but so often it is about the little competitive edges where we esteem ourselves above others and we esteem others less and we love less and we devalue. See, the invitation for us to counteract this heinous, ugly word of hate is for us to know, obey, and love. That's how we know that we know. We know because we live like Jesus and we love like Jesus. So as we conclude our time this morning, and thank you for sharing your time with us, I just want to ask a fairly simple set of questions. Those three words kind of pose the questions for themselves, don't they? I mean, do you know Jesus? Are you having an encounter, an experience with the living God that changes your tomorrow because he wants to change your tomorrow? If not, I encourage you to slow down, invite him in, and experience his presence and have an encounter that will transform you. Obey is the second word. And, is my life, am I living my life in a way that I look the part? Like if no one ever heard me speak, but they just watched my life, would they see that I look like Jesus? Does my life reflect him? And then finally, love. Am I loving in a self-sacrificing way where I'm giving myself away to make sure that I am not esteeming others less, I'm not loving others less, I'm not devaluing that which God has said has value? Interesting reflections for us today. I will let the Holy Spirit do that work in your life like he's been doing and continues to do today in my own life. But I want to invite you, would you bow with me in prayer? So Father, this morning, first, thank you that we can know. Thank you that we can look at our lives and we can do this assessment, and there is a confidence that we can have because we know we're being transformed, because we obey, our lives are reflecting you, and because we love, growing in that loving like you, that as we see those things demonstrating themselves in our life and growing in our life, we know that we're in you. We know that we are in the light. So God, this morning, I just ask that you would help us be seekers of the light. Help us be people who know because we live like Jesus and we love like Jesus. In his name, I pray all of these things. Amen.